coincides with the appearance of certain kinds of arrowheads and spear points, the so-called Clovis culture. But it turns out recent stuff has shown that humans are here much earlier than they thought, not 10,000 years ago when the Ice Age mammals died out, but closer to 13 to 16,000 years ago, long before Ice Age mammals died out. So if humans did it, they did it after they'd already gotten used to these animals, and animals got used to them, which sort of throws that whole thing in a sort of a questionable state. And then there's other arguments that climate did it, except it's not the only time that we had a change from glacial to interglacial conditions. So it's hard to say that climate's a whole story. There's not a clear answer. It's really the simple way to say it. It's very complicated. And I would say that in general, most ideas and most arguments in science are because it is complicated. It doesn't lend itself to a simple yes or no answer.
Awesome. All right, Paul.
Am I frozen? It's still there?
Your picture is frozen, yes, but I can still hear you.
All right. That was good. Actually, you were all over the map on different directions there. With all kinds of good questions.
But you might have to.
Hang on, Paul.
You might have to refresh. Yeah, refresh your browser real quick. It's choppy on there. So while we're waiting on Paul to come back, let me just ask this random question: how long will it be before you're talking earlier about being able to give chickens teeth, the dino teeth? How long before we can actually resurrect a dinosaur? Is that possible?
That's been talked about a lot, but the problem is, in most cases, if anybody who's ever told you about the myths behind Jurassic Park, all dinosaur DNA is far too degraded to ever be used in any real sense. I mean, it's like 1% of it's left, and if we're lucky, in a case something like Mary Schweitzer has, and you don't have enough original dinosaur DNA to ever recover a dinosaur other than maybe a more primitive version of the birds we have now. Because sure, you can start with the bird's DNA and try to reverse engineer parts of it, but you don't have enough to make a dinosaur that we would recognize as a dinosaur. And that's a big problem because DNA breaks down very, very fast. Unlike what they did in Jurassic Park, it does not retrieve from the guts of mosquitoes or any place like that. In fact, it decays almost as soon as the animal dies. And it's so fragile and decays so fast, as a matter of fact, that they have made many, many attempts now to recover the DNA of mammoths that have only been dead for 10,000 years and actually well-preserved, freeze-dried in the Siberian tundra. And those have already degraded so badly they can't use it to ever recover a live mammoth. If that's the case, I wouldn't worry about ever seeing another dinosaur other than birds.
And do you think that movies like Jurassic Park, does that help or hurt sort of your field? Like, do you think did that give off more misconceptions about dinosaurs that you then have to go back and try to right their wrongs, or is it pretty accurate to how they were?
It's both. The first movie in 1993, of course, was based on Crichton's original novel, and Crichton had made the effort to get up to date on what people thought about dinosaurs in 1993. So therefore, the movie itself is fairly good for the standards of when it was filmed, because it does show this, very active, very fast-moving, and mostly animals moving on two legs with their tails sticking straight out behind them. All that stuff is accurate as we knew it back then. And so in that way, the first Jurassic Park movie and book, of course, which it came from, helped break down all these old stereotypes of dinosaurs as sluggish, stupid lizards who dragged their tails and lived in swamps, all of which are now known not to be true. But the problem was the movie then got locked into its essentially a time warp in 1993. And by 1996, we started getting the first of these feathered dinosaurs from China. And by the end of the decade, as they made the second Jurassic Park movie, it was very clear that most dinosaurs, certainly Velociraptor, would have been completely covered with feathers. And yet the movie makers were told this and chose not to. And they did this repeatedly in other movies as well, where they had anyone tell them what the paleontology community agrees on and what evidence shows. They always went for whatever was better for the story or better for the scariness. So I've read somewhere that Spielberg and others said, well, if they had feathers, they'd look like chickens. They're not scary enough, so we're going to leave them naked. That's a movie.
Creative license, though, right? I mean, I kind of get that as a creative license. They're
I know.
Out there to promote the science.
I agree. It's a movie. It's fiction. They're entitled to do whatever they want. It's not a real story. But they got so much right in the first movie, And they have such a potential to keep people up to date because they're the way most people learn about paleontology. They don't learn it from books. They don't learn it from TV documentaries. They learn it from movies. Sad to say, because movies are not true, but unless they're documentaries. But in this case, they had a great opportunity. They could have kept that going. They could have found a way to have a plot device where they recovered the feathers that dinosaurs actually had and had their velociraptors covered with feathers by Jurassic Park 2, which by that time they knew what the reality was. They chose not to. And that's a missed opportunity in my mind.
In Jurassic World, they addressed a new scene in where they're re-engineering dinosaurs. And he talks about they specifically were suppressing the feathers because that's not what our tourists think dinosaurs look like. Yeah, so
that shows you that it's an admission of guilt, right? They know what they should have done, but they don't want to do it, so therefore they put in a line to make it fit their preferred story. That's their choice. It's, to me, as I said, it's a missed opportunity. They could have educated people, and they do. The biggest share of education about dinosaurs comes from them, much more than it comes to scientists or any other educator. They could have done it right. They chose not to.
A T-Rex covered in feathers to me is much more scarier than one covered in scales. Like that to me is frightening.
Well, yeah, and since we don't know what the color of most of those feathers were, you could have made the feathers pretty frightening too. So, they wouldn't have been large feathers. They've been, because feathers originally evolved, as far as you can tell from the animals we have them from now, as a body covering to hold in body heat. And the pterosaurs had them for that reason, and so did dinosaurs. And so they don't necessarily have to have large surface areas. They don't necessarily have to be bright colors, but they can. But either way, they have nothing to do with flight at all. That's another thing that a lot of people get wrong. Think that you can't have feathers unless you're a flying animal. But no, flying is a very late, what they call an exaptation or a sort of a jury rig thing that feathers later turned out to be useful for, but not their original function.
Is it fair to say that most of our fossils about these bird transitions come from China?
The biggest number of them now are coming from these liaoning beds in China, just because they have an extraordinary setting there with a bunch of these fossil lakes of early Cretaceous age that are, the lakes were filled with volcanic ash over and over again. They get really stagnant, and lots of things died, not just birds, but fossil mammals. A bunch of stuff is now known from them that preserve all these soft tissues. Now, we do have them from a few other places. And, of course, the original Archaeopteryx specimens don't have color, but they have feathers. That's how we knew the Archaeopteryx is a bird the first time it was found. So, yes, there are other places as well that are producing some, but by far the best place to see them is in China.
So the follow-up question, I guess, to that is that, of course, there have been hoaxes that have been, false fossils come out of China. And so, unfortunately, that creates a bit of a broad brush of being able to dismiss anything that comes out of China. Would you have an answer to that objection?
Yep. The one example you're thinking of is what they called Eoraptor. That's what I forget. No. Anyway, or Archaeoraptor. Anyway, it was a hybrid of two different specimens that were put together, not deliberately as a hoax, so far as we can tell. The original Chinese farmer who found it put it together because he was trying to increase its market value, make it look more complete. Because unfortunately, a lot of those things are sold in the black market. And so that's the reason for it, not to fool scientists. And then the people who brought it to this country bought it and brought it to this country and were going to publicize it were not paleontologists. They were a group of paleo artists. And they got National Geographic to jump in before it had ever been looked at by scientists. As soon as people like Bill Curry and other scientists who know their way around these fossils looked at it, they realized right away that it was a composite. It was a thing that was patched together from more than one specimen. And then they realized it wasn't a real complete animal. And so that should have been the end of it. But because National Geographic is not a peer-reviewed science journal, it's trying to sell copies, or at least it was back then when it was in better shape, that they didn't listen to the scientists. They published it, and so the whole thing ended up being a big black eye for National Geographic. But it was not a black eye for the scientific community. No scientists were fooled. Okay, the minute real scientists like Phil Curry and others who know their birds from China looked at it, they knew what it was. They knew it was a composite. It wasn't a deliberate hoax to try to fool scientists because it obviously didn't do a very good job. It was a patched together sort of chimera, as we would call it, something patched from several different animals to make it a better specimen to sell on the market. That's where we got. And since that time, there have been no other similar cases like that. Scientists who know what they're doing don't get fooled.
Was it something kind of similar like the Nebraska man then? Because what I found is that the Archaeoraptor is confused with Archaeopteryx a lot, and people throw out there that Archaeopteryx is a forgery, and it's not. Yeah, of course.
But Archaeopteryx is known for 12 very good specimens. So, yeah, Archaeopteryx is not a forgery. It's 12 very good specimens, and no one's ever shown it. Yeah.
It's just a composite, just like Nebraska man, but it wasn't actually a forgery. Trying to like Piltdown man was clearly a forgery.
Right.
So there was a distinction there. Okay.
Piltdown man was a forgery. Nebraska man is a different story. Nebraska man was one scientist who's not very competent getting ahead of his data. The guy was Henry Fairfield Osborne, but just because he was the president of the American Museum of Natural History and also the head of the Vertebrate Paleontology Division, he went ahead and took this very bad single tooth, which is really worn down, and anyone in the right mind would have said this can't be determined as what it is. But Osborne was very convinced that humans had been in North America much earlier, so he looked at this really worn, what turned out to be a peccary tooth, which I actually work on that peccary myself, peccary tooth, and misinterpreted it because it was not a good enough specimen for anyone to determine what it was, and made a big fuss about this Nebraska man, or Hesperopithecus is its formal name. And even the people in his own department didn't buy it, but because he was powerful and because he was influential, his stuff was published and nobody stopped him. And then within a year, they'd all basically found better specimens of the same thing in the same beds that were not as worn down and showed, yes, it was a peccary tooth after all. And it sort of quietly died. And for as far as paleontology is concerned, it's a dead issue. It's an invalid name that we put in our list of other invalid names that have been attached to all sorts of specimens over the years. But creationists, of course, think it's a sign of incompetence. Well, one paleontologist who definitely was incompetent but too powerful for his own good made a mistake, and the scientists themselves corrected it within a year. So it doesn't speak too well to creationists.
What do you say to people who like? There's a couple people in the live chat that, I mean, I can't tell if they're trolling or whatever, but they claim fossils aren't a real thing. And one thing that they point to is the fact that fossils, you never find a full complete set. Can you kind of speak to that, like why that is, and why, even though you don't find a full set, you're still able to kind of map out what the dinosaur actually looked like?
Well, they're false in both respects. First of all, there are dinosaurs and a number of things actually known from very complete skeletons with every bone preserved. And I can think of, for example, the Carnegie Museum baby camarasaur that's on display there, and in many other places of copies of it. There's a number of others that are completely articulated. All those birds, for example, that you find in the Cretaceous of China, every bone is there as well as their feathers. So it's not true that we never find all the specimen intact. Now they aren't the norm; they're the exception. But there are quite a few of them, and so that's a lie if anyone tells you that. Most of the time, yes, carcasses get eaten, get scavenged, get broken up by water currents, bones get disassociated. So most specimens are not known from complete material. But a good anatomist doesn't need every bone to know what's going to be there. It's a part of basic comparative anatomy and vertebrate paleontology since the days of Cuvier 200 years ago, that we know pretty much what other kinds of bones an animal will have based on what we have already, especially if it's partially complete. And so, yes, we can patch together partial skeletons and we can reconstruct what we think is there. And usually, if they're honest, you'll see when they do a reconstruction, they'll show the bones that are known from the bones that are inferred in different color patterns. So you can judge for yourself whether you think they're doing the right thing or not. And we do that usually repeatedly when these things are published and the illustrations of these specimens are shown. But the big point being here is that it's not fakery. Paleontologists are trained in comparative anatomy. I can recognize most fossil mammals from a single tooth, and many of my colleagues can do that too. I can recognize most fossil mammals from certain parts of their skeleton. That just comes with damn experience. And these people who say this had never looked at a fucking bone. Okay, that's it. Dwayne Gish is famous for saying these ridiculous things about fossils. Nobody ever pointed out to him that he was a biochemist, that he has no experience in bones. He doesn't know one bone from another. He's talking out of his ass, or was while he was alive. So that's the problem.
He's quite dead.
We had a gentleman come on here. We had a gentleman come on this show. Actually, we did a debate. Trevor Valley debated this guy, but he claimed that this order many years ago is responsible for burying what we found was fossils in order to trick the Earth into thinking that making people think that the Earth is. There
are people who believe that, and of course that's the old Omphalos argument from Philip Kennedy Gossi way back 150 years ago, just before Darwin the idea the Earth looks old because God created it to be that way.